In the summer of 1367, the kings and princes of Northern Europe receive an unusual communication. It does not come from a king. It does not come from a pope, an emperor, or any recognized sovereign authority. It comes from a congress of merchants, representatives of 77 trading cities scattered across the Baltic and North Sea coastlines, meeting in the city of Cologne to decide what to do about the King of Denmark. King Valdemar IV of Denmark has spent the preceding decade reasserting Danish control over the Sound, the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden, through which virtually all Baltic trade must pass on its way to the North Sea and the markets of Western Europe. He has raised tolls, seized merchant ships, and in 1361 sacked the island of Gotland, attacking the merchant city of Visby and looting it of commercial wealth accumulated over centuries of Baltic trade. His message to the merchant cities of the north is clear. The Sound belongs to Denmark, and passage through it will be paid for on Danish terms. The merchants of the Hanseatic League send their own message back. They declare a commercial embargo against Denmark. No Hanseatic ship will trade with any Danish port. No Hanseatic credit will be extended to any Danish merchant. No Hanseatic city will purchase Danish goods. They pool funds from across their network to finance a war fleet, assemble an army of hired soldiers, and launch a military campaign that within 3 years has forced Denmark to negotiate. The Peace of Stralsund, signed in 1370, grants the Hanseatic cities not merely the restoration of their previous trading privileges, but something that has no precedent in medieval commercial history: the right to veto the succession of the Danish crown. For 4 years following the treaty, the Hanseatic League holds the right to approve or reject whoever becomes the next king of Denmark. A congress of merchants with no territory, no king, and no standing army has just acquired constitutional authority over a sovereign monarchy. This is not an accident. It is the logical endpoint of a system that has been building for over a century. A system that discovers, with extraordinary practical precision, that in a world where commerce is the circulatory system of political power, the ability to control trade is more durable, more flexible, and ultimately more coercive than the ability to field an army. The origins of the Hanseatic League are not dramatic. They do not begin with a treaty or a founding charter or a visionary leader. They begin with fish. The herring of the Baltic Sea in the 12th and 13th centuries are among the most commercially valuable commodities in the known world. They spawn in vast numbers in the shallow waters off the Scanian coast of southern Sweden each autumn, so densely packed that contemporary accounts describe men wading into the water and scooping them up by hand. The Catholic Church's calendar requires abstinence from meat on Fridays during Lent and on numerous feast days throughout the year. Roughly a third of all days in the medieval year are days on which protein must come from fish rather than land animals. Herring, salted and dried, is the fish that feeds most of Northern and Central Europe through those obligatory fast days. It travels well, it keeps for months when properly preserved, and it is cheap enough to be within reach of populations that cannot afford the luxury alternatives. Whoever controls the herring trade controls a significant fraction of the food supply of the entire Northern European continent. Preserving herring requires salt, and the salt required in the quantities the herring trade demands comes primarily from one place in the 12th century. The salt mines at Lübeck, in what is now northern Germany, the largest known salt deposits in the region, capable of producing the industrial volumes required to pack and preserve fish at commercial scale. The city of Lübeck, founded in 1143 and positioned at the western end of the Baltic, sits precisely between Lüneburg's salt and Scania's herring. It is a geographical accident of remarkable commercial consequence. The merchants of Lübeck find themselves at the intersection of two of the most essential commodity flows in medieval Northern Europe, ideally placed to organize the trade that connects them. Hamburg, to the west of Lübeck on the North Sea coast, controls the route through which Baltic goods must pass to reach the markets of England, Flanders, and the Atlantic-facing ports of Western Europe. In 1241, Lübeck and Hamburg sign a treaty of mutual commercial protection, agreeing to guarantee safe passage for each other's merchants along the routes connecting their cities, to share information about pirates and road conditions, and to coordinate their commercial policies. It is a modest agreement between two trading cities, and nothing about it announces the creation of what will become the most powerful commercial organization in medieval European history. It is simply two cities deciding that cooperation is more profitable than competition. Other cities observe the arrangement and attach themselves to it. Rostock, Stralsund, Wismar, Greifswald. The merchant cities of the Baltic coast recognize that the Lübeck-Hamburg framework offers something genuinely valuable, a network of mutual protection and commercial coordination that reduces the cost and risk of long-distance trade for every member who joins it. There is no formal membership process in the early decades, no written charter, no list of members. Cities simply begin attending the periodic congresses, Hanseatic, at which commercial policy is discussed, and through attendance establish their practical membership in the network. The Hanse, the German word for a convoy or group of merchants traveling together for protection, expands organically, city by city, decade by decade, until by the middle of the 14th century, it encompasses over 200 cities and trading settlements stretching from Bruges in the west to Novgorod in the east, from Cologne in the south to Bergen in the north. What binds this network together is not political authority. No Hanseatic city surrenders its sovereignty to any central institution. The Hansetag, the periodic General Congress, has no permanent secretariat, no treasury, no enforcement mechanism beyond the collective will of the cities that attend it. Individual cities can and do disagree with Congress decisions, pursue independent commercial strategies, and occasionally trade with parties the network has officially embargoed. The Hanse is not a state. It is something more flexible and in some respects more powerful than a state, a commercial protocol, a shared set of standards, practices, and expectations that creates enough coordination among its members to function as a unified economic bloc, while remaining light enough to adapt to the different political conditions of 200 separate cities operating under 200 separate legal systems. The practical infrastructure of Hanseatic power is the Kontor, the permanent trading post established by Hanseatic merchants in the major commercial cities of Northern Europe, each one operating as a self-contained Hanseatic community within a host city, governed by its own regulations, exempt from local taxation under the terms negotiated by the network, and staffed by merchants who have exchanged the comforts of home for the commercial opportunities of a foreign market. The four great Kontors in Bruges, London, Bergen, and Novgorod are the anchoring nodes of the Hanseatic commercial system, each one positioned at a critical choke point in the flow of goods between different regions of the known world. The Bruges Kontor, known as the Kontor of Bruges or simply the Bruges Factory, sits at the intersection of the Baltic trade system and the broader European commercial network centered on the Flemish cloth industry. Flanders produces the finest woolen cloth in Europe, woven from English wool, colored with dyes imported from the Mediterranean and exported through Bruges to markets across the continent. The Hanseatic merchants bring the raw wool from England, the Baltic grain that feeds the cloth workers, the furs and amber and wax that Flemish aristocrats and Italian merchants want to buy. And in exchange, they take back finished cloth, southern European luxuries brought north by Italian merchant families, and the silver coin of a monetized economy more developed than anything the Baltic cities can produce domestically. The Bergen Kontor controls something even more strategically essential: the dried cod of the Norwegian Arctic fisheries, the stockfish that is the other great preserved protein of medieval Northern Europe, even more durable in storage than salted herring, and therefore even more suited to feeding inland populations far from any source of fresh fish. The Norwegian fishermen who catch the cod and dry it on wooden racks along the Arctic coastline have no independent means of getting their product to European markets. They depend entirely on the Hanseatic merchants who bring grain and manufactured goods north in exchange for fish, and they depend on the Hanseatic network to find buyers for the fish in the markets of England, Flanders, and Germany. The Bergen Kontor, by controlling the commercial infrastructure through which Norwegian stockfish reaches European consumers, effectively controls the Norwegian fishing economy without owning any of the boats, the drying wrecks, or the fishing grounds. The leverage is commercial rather than territorial, but it is absolute. The Novgorod Kontor, the Peterhof, reaches deeper into the commercial geography of the medieval world than any other Hanseatic installation. Novgorod is the great trading city of northern Russia, positioned at the intersection of the river routes that connect the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian, and it is the primary source of the furs, wax and honey that the Hanseatic network carries westward to markets in Bruges, London and beyond. Sable, marten, beaver and squirrel, the luxury furs that keep the aristocracies of Western Europe warm through northern winters and signal status at courts from London to Venice, flow through Novgorod from the forests of Russia and Siberia, collected by Russian trappers and hunters through a network of inland trading relationships that the Hanseatic merchants never directly engage with. The Hanse does not need to control the fur trade at its source. It only needs to control the single commercial choke point through which the furs must pass on their way to Western markets, and the Peterhof Kontor is that choke point. The rules governing life in a kontor are strict and deliberately restrictive. Hanseatic merchants resident in a foreign kontor are prohibited from marrying local women, from forming business partnerships with local merchants, from sharing commercial information with outsiders, and from extending Hanseatic credit facilities to anyone outside the network. The prohibitions are not primarily cultural, they are commercial. The Hanseatic advantage in any given market depends on information asymmetry and credit exclusivity. If local merchants can access Hanseatic credit on the same terms as Hanseatic members, the network's competitive advantage disappears. If Hanseatic merchants share route information and commodity price data with local competitors, the information edge that allows Hanseatic traders to buy low and sell high evaporates. The insular, self-contained nature of kontor life is not xenophobia. It is competitive strategy encoded as social practice. The credit system is the deepest and most invisible layer of Hanseatic power. Long-distance trade in the medieval world requires credit. Merchants cannot carry enough coin to purchase goods at one end of a 1,000-mile trade route and sell them at the other end in a single season. They need financing, letters of credit, promises of future payment that can be transferred between merchants in different cities, and access to networks of mutual trust through which those promises will actually be honored. The Hanseatic network provides all of this internally among its members through relationships built over generations of commercial interaction in which reputation is the most valuable asset a merchant can hold. A Lübeck merchant arriving in Bruges with a letter of introduction from a respected Hanseatic colleague can conduct business on credit immediately. A merchant from outside the network, unknown to the Bruges kontor, must pay in coin or find an intermediary willing to vouch for him at the cost of their own reputation. This credit structure makes exclusion from the Hanseatic network a commercial death sentence in the markets the Hanse controls. A ruler or a city that antagonizes the Hanseatic Congress and finds itself embargoed does not merely lose access to Hanseatic goods. It loses access to Hanseatic credit, to Hanseatic shipping, to Hanseatic market information, and to the entire commercial infrastructure through which the Hanse's 400 years of accumulated trading relationships have been built. No amount of military force can quickly rebuild that infrastructure because it is not physical. It is relational, built into the patterns of trust and reputation that connect hundreds of merchants across dozens of cities through decades of repeated interaction. England discovers this to its considerable discomfort in 1468, when Edward IV, attempting to assert English commercial interests against Hanseatic dominance of English wool exports, expels the merchants of the London kontor, the Steelyard, and seizes their goods. The Hanseatic response is to embargo England entirely. English cloth, the primary English export commodity, cannot reach its principal markets in the Baltic and Northern Europe without Hanseatic shipping and commercial infrastructure. English merchants attempting to fill the gap find themselves without the credit relationships, the the route knowledge, and the market contacts that the Hanse has spent generations building. English exports collapse. Within 2 years, Edward IV has reversed course, restored the Steelyards' privileges, paid compensation for the seized goods, and granted the Hanseatic merchants even more favorable terms than they had previously enjoyed. England, a kingdom with a functioning military and a powerful monarchy, has been brought to commercial submission by a confederation of merchants wielding nothing but the collective threat of trade denial. The military engagement against Denmark in the 1360s is the Hanseatic League's most dramatic exercise of coercive power, and it reveals something important about the nature and the limits of commercial power as a governing strategy. The Hanse does not go to war with Denmark because it wants to exercise military power. It goes to war because Valdemar IV has made commercial pressure insufficient. He has physically seized ships, physically sacked cities, physically disrupted trade in ways that cannot be addressed through embargo and credit denial alone. The military campaign the Hanse funds and organizes is genuinely effective. Hanseatic forces perform well enough, and Danish resources are sufficiently stretched that the Peace of Stralsund represents a genuine Hanseatic military victory. But the ability to wage war of this scale requires a level of political coordination among Hanseatic cities that the network's informal structure makes enormously difficult to sustain. The war against Denmark is a one-time achievement rather than a repeatable strategy, and the Hanse never again musters equivalent military force. Its natural mode of coercion is commercial, not military, and the Danish campaign succeeds primarily because the embargo that precedes the military campaign has already done significant economic damage before a single soldier is hired. The grain trade is the final and perhaps most strategically consequential pillar of Hanseatic dominance. The Baltic coastlands of Poland and Prussia, the territories controlled by the Teutonic Knights, and later by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, produce enormous surpluses of rye, wheat, and barley, grown on vast flat plains by a serf agriculture that requires no technical sophistication, but generates exportable surplus in quantities that Western European cities, with their more limited agricultural hinterlands, cannot produce for themselves. The cities of Flanders and the Netherlands, densely urbanized and commercially sophisticated, but incapable of feeding themselves from local agriculture, depend on Baltic grain imports that flow through Danzig and the Hanseatic network to survive. Amsterdam, which will eventually displace the Hanse as the center of the Baltic grain trade, builds its early commercial power precisely on the infrastructure of grain shipping that the Hanseatic cities established, then gradually colonized from within. By the late 15th century, the structural conditions that have sustained Hanseatic dominance for 2 centuries are beginning to shift in ways the network is poorly equipped to address. The rise of territorial nation-states, England under the Tudors, France under the Valois, Denmark under a newly consolidated monarchy, creates political entities large enough to eventually negotiate the trade access they need through state-to-state diplomacy rather than through the commercial infrastructure of the Hanse. English merchants, backed by a state willing to sustain commercial conflict long enough to build their own trading capabilities, begin breaking into Baltic markets directly. The Dutch develop shallow draft cargo ships, Fluiten, specifically optimized for high-volume, low-cost bulk cargo transport, undercutting Hanseatic freight rates on the grain routes that are the backbone of Baltic commerce. And the great geographic shift of the late 15th century, the opening of Atlantic trade routes to the Americas and the around Africa route to Asia, begins redirecting the center of commercial gravity away from the Baltic and North Sea network on which Hanseatic power is built, toward the Atlantic ports of Lisbon, Seville, and eventually Amsterdam. The Hanse does not collapse. It declines, slowly and unevenly, city by city, market by market, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, as each of the commercial advantages that had made it dominant erodes in a different way at a different pace. The Bruges contour closes in 1553, when Bruges itself is displaced as the commercial center of Flanders by Antwerp. The Novgorod Kontor is seized by Ivan III in 1494, the year before his death, as part of his consolidation of Muscovite control over the commercial infrastructure of Russian trade. The Third Rome, claiming the trading networks of the north, along with the theological inheritance of Byzantium. The Bergen Kontor persists until 1754, the last functioning remnant of an organization that at its height had governed the commercial life of an entire ocean basin. The final Hanseatic, the last General Congress of Hanseatic cities, is held in 1669. Only 9 cities send representatives, down from the hundreds that had attended the great congresses of the 14th century. No decisions of significance are made. The meeting adjourns without setting a date for the next Congress, and no next Congress is ever convened. The most powerful commercial organization in medieval European history dissolves not through defeat or conquest or any dramatic terminal event, but simply through the gradual withdrawal of the conditions that had made it necessary. The slow erosion of the commercial geography on which 4 centuries of Hanseatic power had been built. What the Hanseatic League demonstrates across those 4 centuries is a principle that commercial history will rediscover in different forms in every subsequent era. That the control of trade infrastructure, the routes, the credit systems, the market information, the standardized practices through which goods move between producers and consumers across long distances, is a form of power that does not require the same physical enforcement mechanisms as territorial sovereignty. It requires something more subtle and in many ways more durable. The construction of a system on which others become so dependent that the threat of exclusion from it outweighs the cost of compliance with its terms. No king grants the Hanse its power. No treaty establishes it. No army defends it. It accumulates through the patient, cumulative work of merchants who understand that a network is worth more than a fortress, and that the most effective walls are the ones that exist only in the minds of the people who cannot afford to be left outside them.